I am here with Juan Belt, who is going to speak a little bit about the Commission for Assistance to a Free Cuba that was established by the administration of President George W. Bush years ago. He's going to talk about what it was, when, why it was founded, and what the results were and where the situation is today.
Okay, basically, I contacted Daniel Pedreira recently because recent events reminded me of the work I did with the Commission to Assistance to a Free Cuba. So I read an article in the American Enterprise Institute by Michael Rubin, and he was saying, how come no one in Washington is planning for a potential transition in Cuba? And I tried to find out if this was true. I contacted many other people that I would think they would be involved, and everybody said no, nobody's working on this. So at least it seems that nobody in the US government is working on this, thinking, well, I'm not in any way saying the government of Cuba would collapse, but the possibility is higher than 0%. Maybe it's 10%, but if it's only 10%, it's still important to plan. So this is in contrast to 2003, when, as Danielle said, when George W. Bush was president. At the time, the Cuban government was, in a way, having lots of problems. Fidel was sick. He had an operation that went bad. So people were thinking, as they thought after the Soviet Union collapsed, that there could be a transition to democracy in Cuba. So that was the purpose by George W. Bush to create this Commission to Assistance to a Free Cuba. And it was headed by Colin Powell, who was the Secretary of State. At the time this commission was established, I was not working for the US government. I was working for the Inter-American Development Bank. And I was working in the English-speaking Caribbean and in the Andean countries. So I really no relation to Cuba, but I, of course, read this in the newspaper, but it didn't seem something that concerned me too much. Now, in 2004, I was reappointed in the U.S. Foreign Service to become the director of an infrastructure office, which was established because for many years, the U.S. Agency for International Development was not funding projects on physical infrastructure. But after the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. government was spending hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure, and there was not a unit in Washington staff with people who knew how to work with physical infrastructure. So I was asked to return to the U.S. Foreign Service to head this Office of Infrastructure and Engineering. So when I returned, I was working really mostly on Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan. I was working in a lot of places that are not so pleasant to visit, quite frankly. But then George W. Bush named the same commission was revived, and this time it was under the chairmanship of Secretary Carlos Gutierrez, who was a Cuban American who was Secretary of Commerce, and the new Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, who had replaced Colin Powell. So at that time, I was not initially involved because I continued to work in countries in the Middle East and Asia. But because I'm Cuban American, I was always interested in Cuba and have written a number of papers about infrastructure in Cuba. I have to say that those papers I didn't write as part of government, but I wrote mostly on weekends, and sort of because of my strong interest in Cuba. And so then the commission, after the commission was formed, headed by Secretary Gutierrez and Rice, they divided the work to plan for a potential transition in Cuba, and they handle assignments to different government agencies. So in the case of energy, which is the topic that I know the best, it was assigned to the Department of Energy. But when the Department of Energy started to do a paper to sort of analyze the situation of energy in Cuba, and they went and they did the usual, which is to go to Google and Google Cuba power sector, they found that the top hits of in Google were papers I had written. And then they contacted me and they asked me to work on this. And that's how I first started working on Cuba. At the time, the idea was that if there would be a transition in Cuba, Cuba would lose the subsidies that it was receiving from Venezuela. So I assume Cuba all of a sudden were to say, I don't want to be socialist, I want to become a free market, democratic country. Obviously, it would not be interesting for Chavez and Maduro to continue providing what essentially was free oil, because we don't know, because the accounts of Cuba are so murky, but it's almost certain that the government didn't pay for it. So if Cuba were to transition to democracy, there would be a tremendous balance of payments and fiscal hole, and then how to fill it and so on. So I wrote a number of papers on this, internal documents, and then I eventually wrote papers using unclassified information that were published by the Brookings Institution, by Energy Policy, by the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, and other places. So now recently I mentioned that I started thinking, well, is anybody planning about a transition in Cuba? And as I mentioned in the beginning, no one is. So I started to dig a bit of information to see some of the things that could happen. And I tried to estimate using a multitude of sources, more or less what I mentioned before, that if Cuba were to, at the time, let's say 2005, 2007, if Cuba were to become, let's say, join the free market and join the West, they could lose the subsidies from Venezuela. So I tried to see what Cuba would lose if it were to move to capitalism. Of course, it would gain a lot of efficiency. We all know that. But that doesn't happen immediately. So what happens if tomorrow there's a change in government? The Cuban government would lose two important sources of revenue. One is the amount they take from the foreigner, from the Cuban doctors, teachers, sports trainers that they send abroad. These people, the government charges the countries where they are working, but the people who actually do the work, the data shows they get between 85 and 95% of what the Cuban government is getting. So this is a tremendous tax. You can imagine this is a tax of either 85 or 95%. So obviously, if there's a change in government in Cuba, it would be impossible, because the way the government keeps these people in almost slavery conditions is because they keep their family in Cuba. So obviously, if it's a move to democracy, those people will immediately stop giving let's say on a conservative way, 85, but even 95% of. So I estimated that. The other source of income for the Cuban government that is not sustainable if there is a change in government comes from remittances. So the Cuban government charges a fee, against it's murky, 3%, it's 10%, but there are two important things. When people exchange currency, they only get 24 cooks per $1, while the exchange rate in the market is maybe 200, depending on the day. So basically, they have a huge differential that is sort of a profit. Additionally, the people who get dollars, if they want to buy goods in special stores where you can buy electronics, but even foodstuffs. So there are foodstuffs that cannot be bought in the regular markets where you use local currency. So when you go to those stores, you could pay a markup of maybe 100% or 200% for a computer. Obviously, this is unsustainable. So I estimated, obviously using different methods, going one way, going the other, to see if the numbers jive. So I estimate that this payment that Cuba could lose equivalent to 11% of the GDP, and equivalent to maybe 22 or 25% of government revenue. So you can imagine if the government, if a country all of a sudden loses 11% of its income, and then the government loses at least, let's say, 25% of their income, there is a balance of payments hole and there is a fiscal hole. And so, you see, who is going to fill that hole? I mean, we're talking that the hole in monetary terms is close to $6 billion. So how this can be solved, I don't really know, but I believe it's irresponsible not to be thinking about it. So that's why I think that some people, and Daniel has made me aware of people who are doing this, Asamblea de la Resistencia, and also I know that I have participated in some events of convivencia. So basically, I am interested in trying to maybe update some of the older studies or even think about this in a different way. So that's my story. There was a commission. Now 20 years have gone by. Cuba is still a communist country. Still, there's no transition. But will this go on forever? I don't know. But we cannot say that there's 100% probability the governments will stay in power. So if it collapses, there are many bad things that can happen. One that worries always the US is that if there's a collapse in civil order, you will have hundreds of thousands of Cubans coming in small boats and so on, and this will be a tremendous problem. The other thing that happened a lot in the former Soviet Union is that the assets get taken over by mafias. You have the famous oligarchs that take over. There was a lot of what they call the literature talks about asset stripping, where these people took over companies, state-owned companies, and then they started selling the assets. And so at the end, these companies were very unproductive because some of the key assets were sold off. And even a term that was invented in the Eastern Bloc was something called round tripping. It's really not that form of obvious stealing, but it's sort of legal but immoral or unethical, where you actually you steal government assets not by just taking away the trucks and selling them, but by, for example, giving a contract to a relative for 3 times what the services of the relative are worth. So that's not necessarily illegal, but it's a way to strip the resources. So my worry is that Cuba could be a tremendous, it could become a place where everybody's leaving at the same time. It could become disorganized. And then the poor infrastructure that exists today could be made significantly weaker. That's why I think somebody should be looking at this in a more thorough way.